Hello, part 5. Let's get right into it, right where we left off. Cannabis, a History by Martin Booth. And we're in chapter 3, about to be on chapter 4. The colonial authorities continued to encourage hemp cultivation. Some states, such as Connecticut, put a premium on hemp in 1722, whilst Virginia used legislation to force farmers into compliance. South Carolina took on another tack and in 1733 employed one Richard Hall for 3 years to promote the cause of hemp. He was in effect cannabis' first public relations officer. 2 years later, a Boston bookseller, Daniel Henchman, published Instructions for the Cultivating and Raising of Flax and Hemp by Lionel Slator. The same year, the state of Massachusetts accepted hemp as tender for taxes at a rate of 4 shillings a pound. For a pound of it, One of the grudges the American colonists had against Britain was the fact that they were expected to produce raw materials which had by law to be sent back to Britain for manufacture. They were then obliged to buy back the finishing goods. Spinning and weaving, other than domestically in the home, were forbidden. Nevertheless, a spinning industry started up using hemp. The British tried to restrict this activity, and under pressure from British mill owners, the British Parliament passed the Wool Act in 1699, depriving the colonists of the right to import wool. The strategy backfired, the colonists increasing their use of hemp and flax. In 1718, a number of professional Irish spinners and weavers, suffering from an economic downturn in Britain, arrived in Boston. Over the next 20 years, hundreds of others followed them to the American colonies, bringing the latest skills and techniques with them and giving birth to the American textile industry. With the parliamentary ratification of the Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed a tariff on imports landed in America, there was a virtual boycott of British goods, which led to an acceleration in home spinning and weaving, as well as an increase in commercial mill output. By the outbreak of the War of Independence, the colonies were more or less self-sufficient in cloth and hemp. Any surplus that arose was exported, mostly to the French, Britain's main mercantile competitor, an enemy of long standing. Yes, anybody knows anything about history knows they had a couple wars that lasted for a few years here and a few years there. Anyway, so yeah, interesting, huh? With the proceeds used to purchase munitions. So yeah, so they were selling the hemp to France and the other thing, not just the hemp, but everything, and and they were using that to purchase munitions. They were getting ready to fight against the crown and gain independence. And see how hemp was a vital part. This plant was a vital part of how this country got its independence. Here it is right here. In the decades following the end of the war, hemp became more than a commodity. It became a currency. And see, there was already little bits of that in the previous part. Um, the various states had had their own monetary systems, but with the foundation of the Union, a federal currency was introduced that undermined them. $1,000 of Virginia's currency was worth only one U.S. silver dollar. Let that sink in. Because of the lack of confidence in local currencies and paper money, which was readily counterfeited, hemp became a currency in itself. Hemp's more or less constant quality and the permanent demand for it made it ideal for barter. It had not been universally used for paper, however, which was primarily by then made from flax, cotton, and rags. Well, the rags, anyway. Indeed, some paper makers on both sides of the Atlantic decried the move from hemp. In 1765, an English paper maker called Christian Schaefer thought of using hemp once again. His sentiments were echoed in 1777 by Robert Bell, an American printer, who suggested hemp paper be made as the country now being an independent nation. There was a need to reduce reliance upon flax and cotton, a substantial amount of which was imported. The first drafts of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 had been penned on Dutch hemp paper. Bell need not have worried. Hemp now being plentiful, paper mills turned to it. Both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who were landowning farmers, cultivated hemp as an important cash crop on their own farms. Jefferson, who preferred growing hemp to tobacco, produced his own cloth from hemp grown on his estate, Monticello. By 1815, his slaves were producing 2,000 yards per annum, although some of this was made with wool and cotton. Soon after, however, he stopped hemp cultivation, writing in his journal that, quote, "the breaking and beating of it, which has always been done by hand, is so slow, so laborious, and so much complained of by our laborers, that I have given it up." Close quote. Where Washington is concerned, there has been much speculation about whether he not only used hemp for its fiber, but also for its resin. In his diary for 1765, he regretted not having separated the male from the female plants prior to fertilization. This has been taken to imply he was, in today's terminology, growing his own stash. Well, it kind of does indicate that, because sinsemilla, that's what you want when you want to grow it for the purposes of smoking the flower. So to separate the male and the female is the fundamental step that gets you there. Okay? Because you don't want this. If you want the plant to produce seed, it's not going to produce as high as quality of flower as it could have potentially without producing the seed. See? So you grow it for what you want out of it. If you want seeds, then you grow it towards that. If you want flower without seeds, then you grow it towards that. And usually with hemp cultivation, and more of the industrial side, you'd not focus on the seeds, but you wouldn't care if they were there. Okay, so you wouldn't have to male and female. So this is an indicator that he was, specifically, at least desiring or regretting he should have done it, that he should have separated them out, which indicates that he probably did separate them out at some point in his lifetime, maybe when he was younger. And, when he wrote this in his diary, he was an older man, and he regretted not doing it that time because he already knew that that was a positive thing to do when you want to grow the flower and it to be as potent with the resin as possible. Okay. Yeah. Good old Washington. Think about that next time you look at your dollar bill. Washington. All right, let's get back to that's how it goes with these, right? With this. So, however, this is inconclusive, Mr. Historian Martin Booth says. So, a researcher, historian. He may just as well have been separating them as part of good hemp husbandry. Okay, well, we just discussed that. Towards the end of the 18th century, Washington started raising what he termed Indian hemp, but which was in fact Cannabis indica, the seeds imported from India. This fact has also been used to suggest he used cannabis as a psychoactive substance. So too, it is claimed, did other early presidents. It has been alleged that Washington preferred hemp leaves to alcohol, that James Madison was inspired towards democracy by smoking hemp, that James Monroe discovered the pleasures of hashish whilst U.S. ambassador to France, that Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor, and Franklin Pierce also imbibed. The 42nd U.S. President, Bill Clinton, here we go, whose middle name is coincidentally Jefferson, and who famously admitted to smoking pot but not inhaling the fumes, may conceivably have had some quite prestigious antecedents. Thomas Jefferson's appreciation of the rigors of hemp farming was not lost on others. Land set aside for hemp had to be plowed and tilled until the soil was friable or freeable. It was not unusual to require 2 or 3 sowings for the seed, which had to be fresh and sometimes failed to germinate. Of course, as do all plants. Once ready for harvesting, the farmer had to face either pulling the plants up by the roots or scything them down, stacking them in bundles like withies to dry in the wind. Once dry, they had to be redded. Ideally, this meant immersing the hemp in water, but many farmers carried out what was called dew redding. Instead of soaking the newly cut hemp, they let it lie on the ground overnight. Then, when it was soaked in dew, they tied it into damp bundles to rot out. Winter retting involved leaving the plants on the ground to rot under cold winter conditions. Once redded, the crop had to be dried again, then broken, either by being threshed by hand or with the use of hand brakes. 2 vertical planks hinged together, the hemp being placed between them, and the top plank swung down with sufficient force to crush the stems but not fracture the fibers. See, you're not wanting to cut, you're wanting to squish it, sort of. See, keeps the fibers all nice, Sorry. It was this work about which Jefferson's slaves complained. And of course, right? To address this, Jefferson modified a horse-drawn threshing machine, but like many hemp cutting and redding machines that were to follow, it was only partially successful. Well, sneak peek, because it's the end of the paragraph, so I'm going to just tell you. Yes, over and over again, they're trying to do this in a mechanical way, and we already had the cotton gin by this point right here. So we were thinking about different machinations, different ways we could do this. And there were different like prototypes, right, of this idea, but they never really were right until certain technologies developed and made it possible. And that happened in the 1930s, late 20s, early 30s, into the 30s. There was a machine patented called the decorticator. 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 And that's a whole story for another day. But just know that. Put that in your back of your head that they actually did perfect. They finally did in the 1930s. But then that technology was suppressed, and there's a whole story behind that. Okay, so that's just that. And then see, hemp slash cannabis, marijuana was outlawed, pretty much outlawed in 1937. But then it continued to be grown as hemp later. He gets into that too. I'm just saying. So that there's a whole other chapter to this, But yeah, they were trying to figure out ways. And yes, the slaves. I mean, talk about something left out of being taught about slavery in America. Where have you ever seen depicted in any movie or anywhere, any textbook, talk about slaves dealing with hemp? The hemp plant. The hemp plant was way harder to deal with than any other. They needed the strongest, biggest people to do this. Men, big, strong, black men, to thresh the hemp and to deal with the hemp, just to deal with it. I mean, we're talking about sometimes 20-foot tall stalks, big, heavy once you get it in a big, and then dew redding when it was all wet and laying there in big heaps on the ground. They were the ones that had to get that stuff and collect it and put it up on a cart or put it up, or carry it, bind it up and carry it on their backs to a barn. It's just, and then to thresh it. The threshing was the hardest thing on any plantation that I'm aware of in all my researching. On any slave plantation was the threshing of hemp was so hard, and it was expected like constantly, and of course it's probably shifted out, depending, and probably one of the main sources of pain and suffering and just the horrible life of a slave on a plantation. And they would give the hardest jobs to the biggest, strongest guys. They would when they had them. I mean, it kind of depends on what kind of place you were a slave of, or how many people and what the dynamic was. Was it a few acres or 100 or 1,000 acres? Was there half a dozen slaves? Was there 50? Was there 100? So yeah, and here we mentioned Mr. Jefferson, and he had a good amount, I think over 100. And he was trying to figure this out. Of course, that doesn't excuse him for owning slaves, owning people. I'm just saying that's a part of history. This is a part of it, and the hemp plant is a major. It's significant. It's historically significant when it comes to understanding, really getting the full picture of how difficult it would have been on a plantation, on a farm, as a slave, and out in the field. Okay, that aspect, that part. I think that part of the story needs to be told more and better and more accurately, and include cannabis hemp in that story, because it really, really was. there. And so, yes, and you had the cotton fields right over across the way, right beside. Yeah, they were there, depending on which state, where you were, what temperate zone, and such. Hemp was all over because it's not as picky on the zone, on the temperate zone, where it's grown. Cotton's more picky. Tobacco's more picky on that front. You can grow hemp in colder climates and it will grow. In more temperate zones. Anyway, I just had to add that. I have to add some things sometimes because we're talking about things that this was the early 1800s where we are right here in the story line. And so I had to add the decorticator thing coming later on, over 100 years later. Finally, guy came up with something, and then by that time, there were major industrialists, barons that made sure that they eliminated their biggest competition, which was hemp, and the decorticator being widely distributed, widely bought by farmers all over the country and the world. Popular Mechanics article in 1938, a new $1 billion crop. Okay, Popular Mechanics, 1938. And there's a picture on the front, a new $1 billion crop. And that's a billion. Even the word billion in 1938 wasn't even thought of that much. Okay. So this was major stuff. And yeah. And so 37, you had this tax act that pretty much made, yeah. So yeah, and you can look into all that. The more conventional history around the how cannabis became illegal in the country in the 20th century. Okay, but this is cool because it shows you a whole other chapter, a whole other aspect. Okay, so let's go on and see where we were. I don't want to leave anything out, so just give me a second. All right. And I don't edit, so that's just part of it. I don't want to edit. Call me lazy. Okay, yeah, I see. Yeah, and the beating of it. I mean, the whole slave thing, And I'm sorry, there's really not a whole lot of other sources about that, but you can tell. You can imagine. You can put two and two together, connect the dots, la la la. Well, Pee Wee, rest in peace, Pee Wee. Last few days. Connect the dots about it. Okay. Where Washington is concerned, okay, yeah, we got to that. Pierce, yeah, I was talking about all kinds of stuff. Had to be redded. Bless them, bless them. Bless those men on that farm, all the farms. So, Thomas Jefferson's appreciation of the rigors of hemp, sorry if I read this already, I'll just start here, was not lost on others. Land set aside for hemp had to be plowed and tilled until the soil was friable. Okay, I remember that now. It was not unusual to require 2 or 3 sowings for the seed, which had to be fresh and sometimes failed to germinate, of course. Okay, we read that. The handbrakes. I mean, I can almost imagine how difficult that would have been to thresh and break it all day long. So it was this work about which Jefferson's slaves complained. To address this, Jefferson modified a horse-drawn threshing. He's tried different things, and basically nothing really worked. Partially successful. After cotton, hemp soon became the most important agricultural crop in the southern states. Where slavery provided the necessary manpower, it was primarily grown in the bluegrass regions of Tennessee and Kentucky, where by 1810, hemp was the staple crop of the latter state, Kentucky, which by 1889 produced hemp valued at $468,000 from 23,468 acres under cultivation. The success of Kentucky hemp was aided by the soil being unsuitable for cereal crops. Interesting. A 1792 act of Congress that, it is more clay soil here, or in most parts of Kentucky. Clay. It's very clay-like, red clayish in parts. Well, only certain plants like that can tolerate that or can thrive in that. And hemp is definitely one that loves it, loves that type, as history proved out. Okay. Unsuitable for cereal crops. A 1792 act of Congress that put an import tax of $20 per ton on foreign hemp, which rose to $60 by 1828, and the increase in the number of slaves bought by plantation owners. Well, there was an increase. They needed more laborers, more hard laborers for that. It was assessed that it took 3 slaves to manage every 50 acres of hemp. If that's true, bless them, bless them. That's way too much for 3 people. Oh my Lord. Oh my gosh. Despite the hard work, the slaves preferred hemp growing to other tasks. Yeah, I debate that with this man. I do. They were usually set a daily target, which meant they had time off if they reached it early. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's where you kind of have to depart from what is actually historically recorded on sheets of paper and use your mind and realize they come on. Don't be daft. Oh, okay. Furthermore, I'm sorry, I disagree with this author about this. Furthermore, some plantation owners paid wages to encourage production. Okay. At harvest time, some slaves were given 1 cent per pound of fiber broken in a day. Over a minimum of 100 pounds. Come on. And I don't even trust those numbers. With much sweating, a sturdy young male slave could earn up to $2 a day. Some earned enough over a few seasons to buy their liberty. Without slavery or machinery, the hemp industry could not have operated. Well, that's what it. Yeah, I would debate that too, because as we've seen in the previous parts of history, a lot of those people didn't have slaves to grow their plants. Come on. Anyway, like you need that. Come on. Some of this, Bless him, man. May rest in peace to the author. He's gone now. I want to be respectful, okay? Okay, so indeed in Kentucky, hemp was so associated with slaves and after emancipation, black tenant farmers that it was known as an inward crop. Slaves who understood the cultivation and preparation of hemp or worked in rope walks were amongst the most sought after and therefore expensive. The 1830s saw a rapid increase in the invention of hemp machinery, especially for the making of rope and hessian. In 1838, David Merle of Philadelphia built a steam-driven factory at Louisville, Kentucky, based upon an invention by one Robert Graves of Boston, from whom he bought the patent. Then in 1841, Andrew Caldwell of Lexington, Virginia, invented a mechanized system in which raw hemp fiber was separated, spun into yarn, and sewn into hessian sacking. Suddenly, there was an alternative to slave and horsepower, although it was several decades before the machinery really took over, after the U.S. Civil War and the ending of slavery. The hemp growers of Kentucky did not, however, have it all their own way. Despite the import levy and the United States Navy declaring cordage produced by the Graves machinery to be stronger than other rope, and an 1842 congressional order demanding domestic product be used by the military at every opportunity, manufacturers using hemp in the New England states were reluctant to purchase American hemp, preferring to buy their fiber from Russia, passing the tax burden on to consumers. At the root of this reluctance lay the most commonly used retting process. American hemp growers' fibers were not as good as the water-retted hemp imported from Russia because dew retting reduced the quality. It was adequate for cheap twine or sacking, but not good enough for ship's cordage. As Americans started to cross the Mississippi and push west, hemp was invaluable to them. His wording, okay? His words, not mine. I would have written this different here. Hemp was invaluable to them. Apart from the harness ropes and canvas awnings of the prairie schooner covered wagons, it was an ideal pioneer crop, providing both the basic fuel and fiber. Blankets, tents, cord, and tough work clothing were all made out of it, although not, as many believe, jeans, which are made out of duck, a heavy cotton fabric. Okay, and there's through that, but there were some hemp jean variants too. Anyway, it was not long before the word hemp entered the Western vernacular. A hemp collar or necktie was the hangman's rope. A hemp committee was a lynch mob, and someone who was on his way to the gallows was said to be sowing hemp. Damn. The Union forces looked into the possibility of growing hemp during the Civil War to replace the cotton they were no longer receiving from the Confederate States. But the plan did not materialize, although inevitably the war increased the need for hemp and the price rose accordingly. And see, hemp would have been growing just fine up north, mostly. And it would have, of course, been south too, but cotton was south too, not as much north. So they're looking into it. The rebel states produced less hemp during the war. What was not destroyed by the scorched earth tactics of the Union troops was replaced by cotton that would be sold overseas for much needed foreign currency with which to bolster the war chests. After the surrender, cotton came to dominate, imported jute replacing hemp. At the same time, paper became increasingly made of wood pulp. Regardless of a brief revival in the 1870s and 80s when it was cultivated in Illinois, Nebraska, and California, hemp production declined steadily, many farmers turning to cereals. The demand for marine rope tailed off too. Increasingly, steel-hulled steamships were replacing sailing vessels. Sailcloth was becoming redundant. Rigging was made of high tensile steel cable, and With the American occupation of the Philippine Islands, Manila hemp could be imported from there. Yeah, taken from them. Stolen from them. Just saying. Some factories continued, but cultivation was much reduced. In 1909, Kentucky, the hemp state, that's what Kentucky used to be known as, right? Really? Had only 6,800 acres put to hemp. So this was a low point, after hundreds of years, really. At least over 100 years, close to a couple hundred years. It's been growing there. Here, that's where I'm at. Good old hemp state. So, Kentucky. In 1909, okay, we're at the very end of the chapter. In 1909, Kentucky, the hemp state had only 6,800 acres put to hemp. And this was 76% of the entire national hemp acreage at that time, 1909. Tennessee had none. Hemp, it seemed, had its day, at least as a source of fiber. And that's how he ends that chapter. Old Martin Booth. Yeah, I disagree with him about some things in that one, and the way he puts things too could have been done better, just more accurately, not just more appropriately, but more accurately. Because a lot of the times those do go hand in hand when you're dealing with history. So yeah. Anyway, chapter 4 next. The shrub of emotion, the morsel of thought. Isn't it though? So, y'all have a good night, and see you on the next one. Chapter 4 coming up. That'll be part 6. Okay. Took 2 parts to get through chapter 3. Oh well. I have to insert my own opinion sometimes. So, that's how it goes. Y'all have a good night. Bless everyone. And may you contemplate these things. Think about these things. Think about history. Appreciate history. Appreciate what came before you. Because it really does matter. It matters to have a good outlook as accurate as you can, seeking the truth as much as you can about the past through what we call history, and just seeking after it is the accuracy of it, of what happened, is the best you can do. So, bless y'all. Talk to you later.